declines. And these are kind of being, this is happening everywhere around the world. So the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity reckons that over the next decade or so, we are set to lose complete extinction, not just species decline, a complete extinction of over 1 million species worldwide. So it's pretty grim. That's the bad news. And as I say, it makes you feel pretty depressed. You really think, what can I do? What can we do in the face of this kind of, you know, environmental destruction and species loss around the world? And there's very good evidence to show that these kind of bad news stories, they really lead to kind of resignation, a kind of an acceptance of the trajectory we're on, and generally just kind of inaction. You think, well, there's nothing I can do. I might as well go on buying my drinks in plastics and driving that big car and not worrying that my soap is made out of palm oil or whatever. That's the kind of attitude it creates, and there's very good evidence for that. Conversely, there's good evidence that when we have good news, it makes us feel positive, it makes us feel energized, and it inspires us to take action, to take change. So although on the whole, the story about our environment is pretty appalling out there, there is good news, and it's important to share that good news. So what I'm going to do now over the next, I can't actually remember, I should have asked how long I've got, but the next few minutes is just to talk a little bit about reasons to be hopeful in relation to the environment. And as I say, I think this is a really good time of year to think about hope and try and be hopeful. Okay, right. So I'm going to give 4 reasons, and they're all very different reasons, really. They're not all just kind of good stories. I'm going to paint a little bit of the context. They're not all about, you know, kind of gorillas in Uganda or whatever. There are a whole range of reasons. So I'm going to talk about teams working together in Cambridge. I'm going to talk about a little bit about what governments are trying to do in terms of policy and the changes that are happening there. I'm going to talk about some of the projects that are happening on the ground, and I'm going to focus there on the program that I manage and some of those projects. And then I'm going to talk right at the end about what each of us can do in a positive sense for the environment and about the cumulative action that individuals can have. So that's going to be the basis of my talk. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint now, so you don't have to, well, you actually, I think you still see me, but I don't think I see you. I think that's the deal, isn't it, Alistair? So
yeah, that's correct. We watch you at all times.
Okay, right. Let's see if I can make this work. Then you get a few pretty pictures.
This is looking good. Looking good.
Is that looking good? Right. Yeah. There we go. So reasons to
perfect.
I've called this, and we've heard the bad news. So I'm going to move swiftly on. That's a flock of starlings in Cornwall. And I'm going to talk, as I say, about 4 reasons to be hopeful. The first one is collaboration. So this is actually where I work, the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. I don't know whether anyone on this call has ever been there. It's housed in a building in central Cambridge, right above the Zoology Museum. And it's an incredible place to work. So I don't know how many of you knew this, but Cambridge is the hub of the largest cluster of conservation organizations in the world. We have here in Cambridge a real center of excellence of conservation, a whole range of people working together to try and address the environmental declines, the issues with global warming and so on that are going on in the world. We have the United Nations Environment Programme. We have Traffic, the organization that's concerned with trade in endangered species. We have Fauna and Flora International. We have the British Trust for Ornithology. They all have offices working out of this incredible building. The organization, the building opened about 10 years ago, and it's already achieving great things. It has, you know, good science, but it has very much more than that. So, and in some ways, this is, I guess, a kind of a bonus reason to be hopeful and to kind of recognize the opportunities, is the real diversity of opportunity there is for people with a whole range of skills to work for conservation. So many people, when you say you work in conservation, they imagine a kind of bearded ecologist with a, binoculars around their neck and a butterfly net or something. But I mean, amongst that group of people you can see in this picture, there are undoubtedly some of those. I think probably I could pick out a few beards. But on the whole, we're actually a much more diverse group than that. So there are people working on policy influence, doing scientific research, working on capacity development, on conservation communications, looking at behavior change, doing fundraising, working on businesses and with corporations, doing legal work related to the environment, work on human rights, on linking the environment to art and culture and human health. There are just so many different areas where the environment is important and where conserving the environment needs those skills. So I think that, what Cambridge and the Cambridge Conservation Initiative demonstrates is all of those skills and people coming together to work for conservation, which I think is reason for hope, because we have fantastic people with those skills. But I think it's also hopeful, I think, the challenge to the environment is often, people do say it is the biggest challenge of our time. It is really something that is urgent and needs to be addressed. And I think the message I'd want to get away in relation to this slide and this point is that there are opportunities for everyone. So whether you are an accountant, whether you are an artist or a poet, whether you work in communications, there are opportunities to really use your skills to support conservation of the environment, environmental issues. And that depends whether, that is irrespective of whether you're nearing retirement and you want to bring those skills to, and all that experience to apply to conservation, or whether you're a young person at the beginning of your career and you've got an aptitude for maths or literature and you're looking at wanting to apply it, you can, I think, apply it to conservation. So that's reason one, collaboration. It's going to change. Yeah, reason two is policy. So usually when you start talking about policy and international agreements, people kind of sigh and switch off and think that's the really boring stuff. And I must admit, at one level, I'm kind of inclined to agree, having attended a few international conventions, but they are actually really very, very important. So the scale of the environmental problems that we're all facing, I'll come on and say this later on in terms of my fourth point, that individual action is undoubtedly very, very important. But it needs to be really within a framework of global policy and global action. Climate change, certainly it needs all of us to change our behaviors, as does biodiversity, conservation, and the choices and decisions that we make about where we go on holiday and what we spend our money on and so on. But that needs to take place within a policy framework really that supports the behavior of individuals and encourages the behavior of individuals. So what governments say and what they sign up to is incredibly important. In some ways, this is kind of old stuff. So there was something called the Earth Summit that some of you might remember in 1992, which was hailed as the big kind of, summit. It was the biggest summit, global summit of its time, and hailed at the kind of the turning point for the planet in terms of environment. That was in 1992, so 28 years ago now. And, as I think we all know, not a lot has happened in a positive sense in relation to the environment since then. A lot of talk, but not much happening in practice. But it does seem at the moment, or seems to me anyway, that environment is finally reaching the top of the policy agenda. So many countries now are talking about, a green growth and a green recovery coming out of what's happened in relation to coronavirus. Next year, there are two really big, significant international conventions: the convention of the CBD, the Biodiversity Convention, and what we call the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. making really important decisions about the future of this planet and the environment. The UNFCCC meeting is going to be in Glasgow. The CBD meeting, the biodiversity meeting, is going to be in China. And we're already seeing governments kind of respond to those events. So just last week, the UK government published its interim target, which was, I think, decline of carbon emissions by 69%. But going on to biodiversity, again, we're seeing some positive policies, which to my mind seem, policies need to be, a policy is a policy. It needs to be backed up by legislation, really. And certainly within the European Union, they have got a new environment strategy to 2030, and they're putting in place some really powerful legislation to force governments to stick to that. And also in the UK, the environment strategy, the 25-year environment strategy of the UK government that covers England and Wales, includes some really interesting and challenging targets. And again, we saw one of them, partly a response to Brexit, but there was a lot of discussion in the news last week about agriculture and funding for agriculture, which many of those declines that I talked about right at the beginning, turtle doves, starlings, habitat specific butterflies, and I could go on the list. It has to be said, I mean, I might have some farmers on the call, so forgive me if I say this, but a lot of them are due to the farming practices in this country. Farming practices that have been encouraged by policy, it has to be said. So, like most of us, farmers follow policies, they're persuaded by financial incentives or so on. But we are beginning to see policy change, legislative change at global, regional and national level, I think, which gives us reason to hope, gives us reason to hope. The one that I put on the screen now here is one that is particularly relevant to the work I do, in that the UN has recognized that we need to do more than just conservation now. So thinking back to those declines that I mentioned right at the beginning, are we happy to live with just 2% of the starlings that we had in 1970? Or do we want to bring them back? Do we want to restore those populations? And indeed, can we survive and live if we don't restore them? I mean, one of the critical things that has been recognized, that actually restoring forests and intact peatlands and wetlands and so on is actually one of the most important strategies for addressing climate change, by sequestering carbon, putting it back out of the atmosphere, but also addressing many of the other challenges that we have. Many of our floods, for example, are a result of getting rid of forests within watersheds, draining wetlands, building on floodplains that would have been natural storage mechanisms. So there's a recognition globally that actually we need to restore these ecosystem processes, and we need to restore biodiversity. And so for the next 10 years, starting next year, it's been designated this decade on ecosystem restoration, which for me, and the particular work that I do, which I'm going to talk about next in reason 3, I think is quite positive and gives me reason to hope if we can really use that as a lever and as a focus for effort on restoring our biodiversity. Okay, so reason 3. So reason 3 is really, actually, we know what needs to be done. We know how to fix this, we know how to bring back biodiversity, and things are beginning to happen. So as I say, I'm going to focus on the program that I manage, or one of the programs I manage, the main one, which is the Endangered Landscapes program. So this is our strapline, Restoring Landscapes for Life. It's a big program. I have to give credit to our donors, Arcadia. It's funded by Arcadia. We just, well, actually I shouldn't, no, I can't say that. I was just going to say something, and then I suddenly remembered I was being recorded, and you were going to get a sneak bit of news there that actually I would have been releasing about 2 months ahead of our official launch date. So I'm not.
Congratulations, David. I've no idea what it was, but I'm sure it's fantastic news. Congratulations.
Anyway, so you'll have to tune in again in 2 months' time if you want to hear what all that was about. But this is a program, and it's all about restoring landscapes across Europe. It's recognizing that we've lost biodiversity from our landscapes. We've lost habitat. Many of our protected areas and areas that we are trying to conserve are fragmented, and that fragmentation is not good. It's not good because of climate change, and climate change means that species, if they're going to adapt, they often need to move. So for many reasons, this program is focused on restoring connectivity in landscapes, restoring species within landscapes, and doing it for the benefit not just of nature, but for people. As I referenced earlier, and I'll come on to again later, we're very concerned within this program of these enriched landscapes, restored landscapes, bringing benefits to people. So these are some of our big projects. They're in amazing places around the world. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about, I think, 3 or 4, and some of the activities that are going on within these areas. These look like amazing pictures, and certainly many of these landscapes, they do still have brilliant intact habitat. But as I'll come on to talk about, they're also degraded in different ways, and they've suffered damage in many different ways. And the program is really looking at healing and restoring those landscapes. So I'm going to kick off with Turkey, Mediterranean Sea, southwest Turkey. This is a nice picture at this time of year, making us all very envious, I have absolutely no doubt. I was supposed to be here in October. We were going to have one of our project meetings, and of course, I had to abandon all plans for that, but I'm hoping it's just been postponed and not cancelled altogether. So this project, well, first of all, this landscape, it does look amazing, and it is amazing. But once you get below the water there, you'll find that things ain't what they should be. One of the main problems here, or I guess the 2 main problems, one has been overfishing, which has really damaged the native fish population. It's also damaged seagrass beds and coral reefs, made it very less biodiverse. It's destroyed a lot of the native fish fauna. But linked to that, there's a problem of invasive species. So because, as you know, the Mediterranean is connected to the Red Sea through the Suez Canal, as we've had global warming and the Mediterranean is gradually heating up, is becoming more and more suitable for many Red Sea species. And increasingly, Red Sea species, invasive species, have been moving into the Mediterranean and are now moving from east to west through the Mediterranean. And some of them are quite damaging. Just as we have, invasive species anywhere, they're not part of the natural ecosystem. So things like pufferfish and lionfish, for example, they're toxic to eat. They gnaw away at corals. They gnaw away at some of the large kelp-like algae, and so they damage the whole ecosystem. So what this project is doing, primarily its main way of working, is actually to introduce, working very closely with local communities, no fishing zones, which ultimately, within only a few years of restricting fishing within small areas, they have a very positive impact on the fish population and the catch more broadly. So it's one of these things where you have a short period of potential pain when your catch goes down, but then because these no fishing areas act as kind of sanctuaries and fish species move out of those sanctuaries, the fishery more widely benefits. So no fishing zones benefit the fish population, but I guess even more importantly, the kind of a healthy fish community makes it more resistant to the invasive species that are coming in. So it allows these native marine communities to resist the invasive species coming in from the Red Sea. So that's mainly the focus of this project, and it's been hugely successful. It's been hugely successful. They started with a pilot, and then through our program, we gave them another $3 million, which they're extending that pilot for about 500 kilometers of coastline. So really, the potential for change is dramatic. And this year, they had some really successful results, creating some new no fishing zones. So we have big hope for that. Here's a traditional fisherwoman. As you can say, the traditional way is quite small boats. There are other threats which I won't go into with larger bottom trawlers, but most of the traditional fishing, and these are the people that the project is working with, working out of quite small boats. Another element to this is the Mediterranean monk seal. This is the Mediterranean population. The monk seal is one of the most endangered seals in the world. And again, this has suffered within the whole of the Mediterranean through particularly disturbance of its breeding habitat. So they haul out and breed in caves. So they have an absolute requirement for caves. And of course, caves are very popular for kind of tourists, for canoeists. You know, people go and they sit on the beach and play in the caves and things. So that kind of level of disturbance isn't very good for monk seals. So this project has been working again very closely with the tourism agencies, but also looking at the coasts where there are some caves that aren't suitable because they don't have ledges for the seals to haul out on. So again, a bit of innovation through this project has been to create caves, concrete and rock ledges within these caves, and they are starting to be used. So that was one of the major kind of limiting factors for that population, is the number of suitable caves. So again, we're beginning to see some really positive and hopeful signs there that we can support increases in the population of this endangered Mediterranean monk seal. Okay, moving on further east to Romania. So this picture probably speaks for itself. You can see here a hillside that has been clear felled of its forest. And Romania, I expect some of you will know, it's been, you know, in the news because of the forestry issues quite a lot over recent years. Coming out of the kind of Soviet era, a lot of the forests which were nationalized by the Soviets were then returned to their original kind of customary owners. And sadly, with little experience and living in dire poverty, many of them without much knowledge of what they were doing, they sold the timber rights. The timber companies moved in and they just mined the area like this. Absolutely horrific. So we're working with a project there that is basically looking to restore these forests, to either replant them or where natural regeneration has a chance to take off, to allow natural regeneration. There's still a lot, as you can see in the background, there still is a lot of intact forest. And then within it, there are these areas of clear fell. So this is quite an exciting project. They're working again with local communities to do a lot of tree planting. They're producing all the trees in their own nurseries. But then they're going one step further. So there are some elements of this system that are missing. And one of the key ones is bison. So bison used to occur here, but not for about 200 years. They've been extinct, but they're a natural part of the ecosystem. And quite an important part of the ecosystem in terms of, disturbing the vegetation, creating spaces within the vegetation for other species to, come in and populate, particularly in terms of kind of vegetation and the insect population as well. So this project has been introducing populations of bison, and again we're quite excited that it's restoring the kind of natural structure and kind of populations of animals that used to take place within this area. It's all part of an initiative which they're hoping to create a new national park for Romania in this area. It's part of the Carpathian Mountains, called the Fagarash Mountains, but it's part of the main Carpathian mountain chain. Closer to home, the Cairngorms in Scotland. So this is a wonderful looking area here. You can see this is part of, I think I'm right, this is part of Glenfeshie that we're looking at, which has been undergoing a form of restoration for quite a few years now. You can see quite a few young emerging trees. But as many of you will know, over much of the highlands, that is quite unusual. the Highlands of Scotland have suffered quite badly and continue to suffer quite badly from management that has basically had a number of components to it. One is planting of Sitka spruce and so on for timber, but more widely, it's managing moors for grouse shooting and deer shooting. And those two practices have really destroyed the natural vegetation over the years, or rather, it's prevented it from recolonizing after a number of other kind of historical practices. But much of the Highlands, and what we see as the Highlands, and indeed much of the kind of uplands throughout the UK, should really be forested, but it's not. And particularly on peat soils, that creates all kinds of problems, again, in relation to climate change, with release of carbon through eroding peats, but also flooding downstream, because these systems are not as good as retaining water. Without the tree cover, they dry out and so on. So a range of issues related to both to biodiversity and to ecosystem process and services. So what this project is doing, it's called Cairngorms Connect. It's led by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And they're looking at restoring Caledonian pine forest and other kind of natural habitats, natural floodplains, over about 60,000 hectares of the Cairngorms. So it's quite a big project, quite an exciting project, and is well underway. This is one of the things they're doing with kind of Sitka plantations, ring barking them, which actually, you know, it thins them, it creates light and space for native species to come and colonize, but actually it's really good as well in just creating dead standing wood, because a natural forest would have a lot of dead standing wood and a lot of beetles and birds that depend on it. And unfortunately, because so much of our habitat is managed and timber is removed, there isn't the standing wood that there should be. And there are a number of, again, insects in particular, and birds, as I say, that are dependent on dead standing wood. So that's what's happening here. The other side, of course, and apologies for those that might be sensitive towards this, but it has to be done, really. There are just too many deer in the Scottish Highlands. It's bad for the deer. They suffer because there's not enough food. The estates themselves have to kill huge numbers just to maintain a healthy population. And what this project is doing is really trying to bring that population down to levels where trees can regenerate, and we can get some fantastic forest back again that will be good for pine martens, for capercaillie, for red squirrels, you name it. It should be fantastic. I would say it's a 200-year vision, so this isn't going to happen overnight, but they're making good progress. Okay, the last of the examples I'm going to use from projects is going now back to Iberia this time, the Koa Valley, which is in northern Portugal. This is kind of south of Porto, south of the Douro, if anyone knows the Douro region. This is an area that has suffered over the last, well, over millennia, I suppose, it's been cultivated. And in recent years, it has experienced very high levels of outmigration. The soils, the agriculture on these rocky, thin soils just isn't profitable, but also in remote communities badly served by services, schools, shops and things. People just don't want to live there anymore. So whole villages have been abandoned. It is astonishing to go there. These, you know, it's not just one or two houses, it's whole villages that people have abandoned. This, in the main picture there, that little round hut is a kind of pigeon dovecot. And these are scattered all over there. And I thought they'd be ancient, but actually I was told they'd been built about 40 years ago. And this was one of the kind of efforts to both provide a meat supplement in a very, very harsh region, but also producing a guano that was collected from these dovecots and spread on the fields to try and increase the nutrients. But basically now it's gone into decline. And this has provided both a problem and an opportunity. The problem is Much of the vegetation, the shrubby vegetation, is very prone to fire. And a couple of years ago, there were very bad fires in this part of Portugal. But it's also created an opportunity in that many animals that had gone from this area beginning to return. So things like Iberian lynx and the Iberian wolf as well are beginning to return. So this project is working to really manage that restoration, that kind of natural restoration of wildlife, and to really support the opportunities that it creates by, first of all, working with remaining livestock owners, shepherds and cattle owners, to manage and help create conditions where they can live in a kind of peaceful coexistence with the wolf and the lynx, but also looking for new economic opportunities related to tourism and so on. But this really very beautiful historic area that's now becoming increasingly rich in wildlife can offer. And I'll come on, I think, to talk about that. Oh, I've got another example. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, Alistair. I'm not quite, do we have to wrap up by past? Is that the plan?
We do, I'm afraid, David.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk very briefly then. Last example here. This one is all about, in the Danube Delta, removing dams. So again, in the Soviet era, lots of dams were built to try and produce rice and so on. And of course, that created barriers to movement of important fish like sturgeon and so on. This project, another one which we're supporting, is really restoring those waterways, restoring a hydrology and the connectivity so those species can move in again. I'm going to jump through some of these last bits because I want to come on to the last factor. So all of this is, we're not just doing it for the animals, we're doing it for a whole range of other reasons as well, not just the biodiversity. So as I mentioned, it's all about creating jobs, economic opportunities for people, and preserving and recognizing that culture in these areas is really important. And often the culture is linked to the landscape, linked to traditional uses, and linked to the wildlife. So that's an important part of what we do. Carbon as well, I've mentioned that in trees and things, but seagrass beds, they are actually one of the biggest and most important stores of carbon, and we mustn't forget what's called blue carbon. Again, that's an important part of the programme. Ecosystem services, I mentioned, this is a river in Spate in Scotland, and again, restoring those peatlands, restoring the forests on the hillsides will help regulate a river flow and reduce the incidence of flood. So this is another very important reason for restoring our ecosystems. Okay, my last reason. Reason 4, we can all make a difference. So I know sometimes it feels, you know, our contribution is tiny, but I really firmly believe, and I think probably, I'm almost certainly speaking to the converted because otherwise you wouldn't be on this call, but we can all make a difference by small actions. We can act through our vote and getting in the political party that is most important and that is most supportive of kind of green and environmental policies. But we can also, you know, take action through our own behaviours. And we can march. So I've slipped in a picture of my daughter here in the inset, who I'm afraid from the early age, this certainly wasn't her first march either. I think probably she was a babe in arms on some of the first marches that we went on. But she was a very willing participant, I think. Given a placard to wave, she'd have walked anywhere, no matter what it said, I think. But anyway, so we can all make a difference. You know, people say, oh, you know, it's society that is the problem, but we need to recognize that each one of us is a member of society. So to illustrate this last point, I'm just going to talk about gardens. So I expect many of us have gardens. I can't actually remember the figure. I think it's 87% of households, quite a high percentage of households in the UK have gardens. And here's a figure that astonished me. The total area of private gardens in the UK is 4,000 square kilometres. 4,000 square kilometres. So for me, that is a kind of an astonishing large figure. And I think I've kind of used this as an illustration of how we can each make a difference, because we are all, you know, probably everyone on this call is a part of that 4,000 square kilometers. And what we do in our garden, cumulatively, we can make a difference over 4,000 square kilometers of green space. So this is actually a picture of my parents' garden, sadly no more. They were absolutely avid gardeners, but they also got quite into thinking about, you know, creating spaces for wildlife. So here you can see, you know, they were quite creative about their mowing, and they just left areas of grass to grow long. And I think they, you know, planted a few oxeye daisies and oxlips and things in it. And we can all do that in our gardens, letting them grow a bit wilder, letting the grass grow a bit longer, leaving a few kind of dandelions and poppies in the vegetable bed, getting rid of all those pesticides out of the shed, thinking about what we plant. There are certainly some plants that are better for birds and bees and butterflies than others. And there are good websites that will tell you all about that. Putting up bird feeders, putting up, you know, bug hotels and things like that. There's lots that we can do even in our gardens. So I suppose that is really my final message. We can all make a difference, even if it's only in our gardens. So the last thing I want to do, though, is bring up our pictures again, and we're going to play our 10 fingers game. But just to make you feel a little bit better, we're going to do it in reverse this time, because I've got a few good stories to share. So if I'll stop sharing my screen, and then we can see everyone's smiling faces again. So this time, hands up, if we could just start with sorry, 2 fingers. So that is how many Eurasian lynx there were in 2012. Sorry, I beg your pardon, in the early 1960s. The population has increased by 500%. So that's a nice bit of good news. That's the Eurasian lynx. So we don't yet have lynx in this country. I'm still hopeful that we might do. There's certainly a campaign to bring them back. But one species that we do now have is the common crane. So if you can put up one, I'm hopeless at this, 1.5 fingers. Oh, imagine I've got 1.5 fingers up there. Okay, 1.5 fingers. So that is how many we had in 1985. That is the Western European population of common crane. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to have 1.5 up. 1.5 up. The number we have now is that many. So that's the Western European population of common crane. And some of you will know that the common crane bred in Wicken for the first time in about 120 years, the year before last, and it bred this year as well. So, and there are populations in Lake and Heath and in Norfolk. So we're beginning to see recovery in this country as well. So last one, and this one is even more dramatic. So you're probably not going to be able to do this, but basically we've got to show just the kind of the nub of one little finger. That is the population of the Eurasian beaver 60 years ago, just tiny. Now we have in that period of time, so 60 years, it's increased by 14,000%. Really massive, massive increase. So the European population estimate now is about 330,000 from, I think, whatever it was, a population of about just over 2,000 in 1955. And again, the population is increasing in this country as well. So it went extinct in the UK 300 years ago. Now they're reckoned to be about 400 beavers in the UK. So exciting. Things can come back. There are reasons to be hopeful. I'll leave it there.
David, that was absolutely fantastic. It was so exciting to see all those good news stories, and what wonderful habitats and creatures you get to work with. I mean, building beds for monk seals. I mean, that's just, I love that. And bringing back wolves. Oh, fantastic. I love that. So I'm so pleased that you brought us hopeful stories. It's a good time of year. It's also a good year to hear some hopeful stories, isn't it? And that was kind of my first question, and you did allude to this, but if anything good is to come from coronavirus, can we see anything about the way our behavior has changed, our behavior, our habits have changed, that you see some hope in this year?
So I think one thing that I think is certainly true, that people have, I think, recognized the importance of the environment as a place to find kind of solace and to kind of retreat to when everything else is going on. And I think people have certainly, I think, discovered local wild spaces and green spaces that they probably didn't previously know existed. So certainly around here in Wick and Fen, during the kind of, lockdown periods with restricted travel, the number of people that were suddenly coming to the Fens and to Reach just shot up very, very noticeably. People, I think, probably coming from, Cambridge and Newmarket and, I don't know how far afield they were coming, but certainly the kind of local towns were coming here as a place to, to get into the open air and to enjoy being outside. So I think there's been an awareness of the importance and an awareness of what is available locally. I think it's certainly, the coronavirus issue at a global level has drawn attention to the kind of origin of these viruses. I should probably hand over to you here, actually, Alistair, or if there are any other kind of medics and virologists and epidemiologists around, but certainly one of the, I think it's more than a theory, but a recognition that, that these viruses, and there are other viruses, the SARS virus, the Ebola virus, they are being transmitted to, people from wild animals, basically, and entering, the human system. And there's certainly more than a suggestion that is becoming more common because of the boundaries between, human civilization and natural areas are being broken down as we break into their habitat. But there's also a strong suggestion that these many species are carrying these viruses more, and the viruses becoming more virulent because they are stressed within degraded habitats. So there's a whole complex set of issues here that I can't claim to fully understand. It's not my area, but there is definitely a concern that issues to do with coronaviruses and other viruses like this are going to become more prevalent and are at a higher risk because of environmental destruction and habitat degradation. So these things aren't unlinked, they are all interlinked. And that is being recognized, I think, and governments are beginning to think about strategies that they should be putting in place. It is putting more emphasis and more kind of pressure on governments and countries to take conservation seriously.
Thank you, David. And the question's just come through about rewilding. So what is rewilding? And I noticed you didn't actually use that phrase in your talk. You used the word restoration. So is there something significant in that?
Well, so I do use the word restoration rather than rewilding. So rewilders, so often rewilding, it's an interesting word because actually it's very poorly defined and many people define it in different ways. But the common way of using the word rewilding is much more about basically creating a system where natural processes restore the habitat. So, basically you bring the wolves back, you bring surrogates of maybe the lost aurochs, like, water buffalo back, you put them into a system and they themselves kind of restore the processes and restore the biodiversity. Part of the problem with rewilding is that it's become associated with a sense that in order to rewild, you need to depopulate, you need to take people out of the equation. And one of the things that we're very keen on is that actually, particularly in Europe, yes, there are wild places, but much of Europe is populated, and it is entirely possible for people to live comfortably alongside even wolves and lynx and bear and wild boar and so on.
And bison,
if it's done in the right way. So we prefer to talk about, I prefer, with our program, we prefer to talk about restoration, because we think that actually it's much more kind of people focused in its approach. Even at the end of the day, many of the outcomes in terms of biodiversity and natural ecosystem processes and climate resilience are the same. It's more about the basis of the approach. We think it often involves more active management, and it needs much more recognition of the human and people within the system.
I've got another question here. I like this question. So compared to many people in the world, the one thing that distinguishes us, I'm guessing this is people who live in the UK, is that we have lots of money. And so who can we give money to help? And I think this is, this is a real issue, because the standard sort of charities we give money to at Christmas don't include conservation and restoration charities, leaving a Russia to one side just for the minute, I guess. What is the natural way for us to change our giving behavior to help this sort of work?
Well, you kind of, given the constituency I'm talking to, you kind of took the, I was going to suggest a Russia, is probably a good organization to support. They're doing amazing work, not just in the, there's a Russia UK, but there's a Russia International. There are Russias in many different countries around the world. They're doing brilliant brilliant work. You can go onto the website, you can choose who you want to support. They even have, if you want to offset your carbon, they have their own carbon stewards, I think, or climate stewards scheme to offset your carbon into. So I would say as a champion of a Russia, that they'd be a good place to start. There are many different conservation charities. If you've got a particular interest, if your passion is butterflies, then support Butterfly Conservation UK. If your passion is birds, support one of the bird conservation organizations. But if you, I think, want to reflect both your faith and your interest in the environment, and the whole idea of kind of Christian stewardship, then I would suggest that a Russia is a good one to go for.
And another question, which I think follows that in the sense of a positive comment: how is your organization funded, David? So this may be someone who wants to give you millions of pounds. So answer this question carefully.
Well, so I'm actually, the program that I described there is currently funded by one very generous philanthropist through her private foundation. We're still always looking for millions, if people got millions to give us, but that's the primary fund for that particular program. Her name is Lisbeth Rousing. Some of you may know that name. She's part of a wealthy family. Her father was the instigator behind Tetra Pak. So that's where their family fortune comes from. But she's incredibly generous. So so she funded us to the tune of $30 million in our first grant, which we then give away to projects, and we've got more money in the pipeline. But generally, money comes from different sources. But I'm based at the university. We apply for funding. I'm applying for funding. The last chance to get a grant from the European Union, Horizon, something called their Horizon 2020.
Oh, well done you. Good effort.
Alistair's probably applied to Horizon 2020, I imagine, on other things. It's an absolute...
Not successfully.
Oh, right.
Successfully.
It's dominated my life since September, writing this proposal. They involve consortia of organizations from all over Europe. So
complete nightmare.
Consortium meetings, but basically European Union funding, Natural Environment Research Council funding as well, working with the university. We have a big bid going in there. So we look around for funding wherever we can to really support what we think is important, vital work.
Well, David, we've come to time, and I did promise people we'd end on time, but we could carry on talking a lot more, and there's some questions I haven't passed on to you. But I do want to thank you. I especially want to thank you for coming and giving us that hopeful message, because I certainly needed it, particularly after this, which was utterly depressing. So it was really nice to be able to reverse that trend.
Well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. We'll give you a round of applause in a minute. Let me just briefly give a plug for next week. Tim's on the line, actually. So, Tim, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting yourself just a second. Tim, you're at the younger age of the spectrum, given that David has announced he's at the older end. So, Tim, it'd be a great pleasure to listen to you next week. What are you going to talk to us about?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and thank you for inviting me, Al. I will also be talking about reasons for hope. I think reasons to keep fighting, but maybe in complement with what David talks about this evening from a science and conservation perspective, I'll be trying to look at a biblical perspective on this. So I'm a marine biologist. I'm in Exeter at the moment. That's where I work. And I think there's a bit of a tendency sometimes to imagine that the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about this stuff, or maybe that what it does have to say is sort of pocketed away in Genesis and the Psalms. But I think there's loads that we sometimes underappreciate all through the rest of Scripture. So we'll be looking at a broad overview of what the Bible can say to inspire us and hope us, and give us hope, in this area, diving in particular into John and into some Christmas carols as well. There may be some special guests as well. Is that right?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm hopeful of that. Let's not announce that unless it doesn't happen. But I am hopeful.
Some mystery special guests.
Mystery special guests. I really hope we can manage that. Now I'm going to unmute everybody. So, David, this is going to be applause. It's going to sound like a terrible cacophony, but it's our way of showing our appreciation for you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. You've really inspired us and encouraged us and given us lots of hope. Really appreciate it.
Cheers anyway.
Thank you very much, everybody. This time next week, it'd be lovely to see you if you're free and available.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.